Hi everyone, this is Grace and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to learn how to decorate this glamorous fall pumpkin set. So up first, of course, is this leopard cookie that inspired it all. For almost all of the cookies in this set, I am doing a 2 consistency outline and flood. I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. For this cookie, this is a very intricate full wet on wet. So I want to have the most control with my flood, and I can get that with a 2 consistency outline and flood. I think one of the biggest issues that happens with wet on wet, one of the biggest mistakes, is that the icing will overflow because you're adding too much icing to the cookie with the design. When you're doing a 2 consistency, that can help with that issue because that thicker piping on the outside will help to hold the icing in. The other thing with a 2 consistency is that I can use a thinner flood, and when you're doing wet on wet, you're really working against the clock here because the longer the icing sits, of course, the more it will crust over, and the thicker the icing, the faster it will crust. So if you're using a thinner icing, then you have a bit more time to work with it. For this cookie, you can see I am doing these squiggles, and I actually do them on almost all of the cookies for this. And this is to help with craters. Craters happen always with royal icing. It's just a fact of the medium you're working with. I believe it is because of the meringue powder in the icing. It weighs it down. Now, craters. What do I mean by craters? Craters are that indentation in the center of the icing spot. So this does always happen. It's just on a larger surface cookie, you can't tell because the indentation is so mild on such a large surface. But with these smaller surfaces, the indentation is much more pronounced. So these squiggles are used, it's piping consistency. It's put in the center of the shape, and the hope, the intention, is that it will help to stabilize the center of that icing so that the meringue powder doesn't weigh it down as much. I prefer to do my flood if I can while the squiggles are still wet. I do this for a couple of reasons. One, if the squiggles have hardened and maybe you did them a little too high, then your flood is going to look a little dented because of the hard squiggles underneath. I also like to think that if you do the flood while the squiggles are wet, then somehow the 2 icings can kind of join together better while the piping squiggles are wet. So that's why you see me doing just one section at a time, because if I had done the second section squiggles here, then it would have dried by the time I got to this second bit here. It can be a little bit more difficult to flood on top of. As you can see here, I'm moving pretty slowly trying to get a good flood. You do need to then really raise the bag above the squiggles in order to get a good consistent flood. So I am going to use my scribe here just to help it settle a little bit, make sure it's all good enough to go before I actually do the wet on wet design here. I love doing this leopard design, and actually this was my first time doing it. It's very flexible with colors, and it looks great even if it's kind of messy. It doesn't need to be super precise. You're just doing bigger spots, smaller spots, moving as quickly as you can because this technique does take a while. Then I'm going in with my darker color and just kind of haphazardly outlining some once, twice, adding some extra spots. You likely noticed that I freehanded outlining the center sections of this cookie. If you are not comfortable doing that, you can certainly use an edible marker to trace out the sections first. Now, I did let those first two sections crust over. That's approximately 15 minutes in a dehydrator, maybe around 30 minutes without a dehydrator. And the reason I did that was because I'm also using a technique here called flooding in sections, which means that you do alternate sections of flooding, let that crust, so then when you do the other sections, there is definition that is left in between them and not flat like a wet on wet look. It can be difficult to flood the alternate sections to get a good nice seam. I personally prefer to not use a scribe at all. I find that when you start using a scribe to help fill in the alternate sections, that it can really mess with your with the seams. I am using a scribe here just to help the center settle and get that little corner that I didn't use, but you'll notice that I really flood right up to the edge, and that gets the cleanest seam in my opinion. If I am going to use a scribe, I am not going to get anywhere near that seam on the side. The closest I would probably get is maybe 1/4 of an inch. And again, it's just because the jiggle of the scribe kind of flattens out that seam and defeats the purpose of doing the flooding in sections in the first place. For all of the cookies in this set, I did a very simple stem, one color flood, and then pipe this little squiggle on top. So I let all those sections dry, and now I am going in with gold highlighter. This is Truly Mad Plastics brand. I mix it with 190 proof Everclear. The reason I use this, it gets the best color. It is alcohol, however, the alcohol evaporates quite quickly, so I am often adding more Everclear to the dust as it starts to evaporate just while I'm working with it. I'm using a very small brush here just to get these accents. It is important to note that highlighter is only marked by the FDA as non-toxic. It is not totally edible according to their standards. It depends on the country you're in, how they feel about this highlighter. If you do want a totally edible version, there is one by the Sugar Art. So that is the first cookie, and we are on to the second. For this one, I am not flooding it at all, but I did have some sections that I really needed to pay attention to. You could use an edible marker here, but I wasn't sure about the coverage if the marker would have shown through, so I decided to just use my scribe and kind of trace out the sections that way. So here I am. This is pressure piping, which means that I'm starting with a good amount of pressure, creating a ball, and then releasing pressure and dragging, creating a lot of pressure, releasing and dragging. So the releasing and the dragging happens at the same time, and that creates this beautiful sweater texture. Now for this one, I decided to alternate directions just to give it a little more pizzazz. I am right-handed, so I found going at it from the left side very difficult. It might look like I'm doing just fine here, but I found the angle very difficult to pipe from, even though I was using this cookie swivel. Cookie swivels are great when you're doing a more complex cookie. I'm a big fan of always moving your cookie to the direction that you need it to decorate. You saw me use that scribe there very quickly. There was an ear bubble in one of the piping, so I just used that scribe to poke the air bubble. This is piping consistency, and you can see I'm doing that technique again to hopefully prevent any craters. I'm using flood consistency here. Probably my favorite about how I decided to finish off these stems, and you'll see this in a second. I do think this nice little squiggle does a good job of distracting from any craters you might have. In my case, you can see there's a nice puff here, which I'm super happy with. For this next step, I have allowed all of that icing to dry almost completely, and again, I'm using this highlighter to paint on. I typically use the edible dusts from the sugar art, but it's just this color on this particular highlighter. The gold is just so perfect. It's unmatched in an edible version, and I just fell in love with it with the colors that I was using. It gets such good coverage, and I wasn't using a lot, so I felt okay with it. You'll need to figure out with your customers, with the people eating it, if they're okay with eating the highlighter or not. It's up to you. So for this next cookie, I am quite painstakingly outlining all of the sections before I go to flood. And I'm not doing a wet on wet for this, but this is a very long cookie. These are hard sections to cover cleanly because of this long straight line. So for the sake of the cleanliness of this design, I decided to do a 2 consistency outline in flood. I do want to note that I edit out the transitions in between different colors and different consistencies, the amount of time that it takes me to just switch my bag, just to attempt to shorten these videos ever so slightly more, but just so you know, it doesn't happen this quickly. I'm not that magical. So again, this is a flooding in sections, which means I have let those first two alternate sections crust over, and then I move on to pipe the remaining alternate sections. Now, the final details on this cookie was a true act of piping straight lines. What's really important when piping straight lines is to pull your bag up about 1/2 inch to 1 inch off the cookie so that you are just guiding the icing. That's going to get you the straightest lines. Now, as you can see here, I actually broke the line as I was piping it, and as I finished it, I thought, do I try to add more icing to fix the line? Or as you can see here, what I decided to do was to completely remove the line. It can be really hard to make lines seamless when you are patching them together. You can see that it did kind of leave still a mark on the cookie just because there was wet icing there. And all I did was just make sure that I piped exactly on top of that so you couldn't see the line. But I was happier with this decision because it gave me the cleanest looking line. Doing lines like this is all about dragging and guiding your icing. You need to get really comfortable with the consistency of your icings, how fast it is coming out of the bag, so how much pressure you're putting on the bag, and then how you are guiding the icing. If you read music, it's that concept of you want your eyes to be ahead of the icing so that you're guiding it to the right place. Now I did let the dots and the lines dry, and again I'm using this highlighter to paint with a very small brush. And there we have that cookie. And we are on to the next one. This kind of combines the techniques of the dark brown cookie I just showed you and then the leopard print cookie. So first I'm going to outline all of the sections. We'll be doing the flooding in sections, alternating, and then a leopard print scarf on top of the cookie. So for the scarf, I'm using a pretty thick outline. That's because this is an uneven surface and it's going to prove kind of difficult to keep the icing inside this section. You can see streaks in the cream that I just flood, and that's because my icing started to separate. It's totally natural. It's when the liquid separates from the meringue powder and coloring. All you need to do is just give your bag a good massage, or if you need to, dump it out into a bowl and just remix it. For this scarf, I am doing a flooding in sections so that I can get definition. So I let that first section crust, and now I'm moving on to the second. And here I'm actually going to double up on my lines because this surface is so uneven. And the first few cookies I did, I actually had some overflow on this outside edge. So I realized that I needed to double up on the lines to keep it from falling over. Here I am flooding it immediately, and I actually wish that I had waited until that outside edge dried a little bit to even better help the icing to stay in. So you can see on this cookie, I've combined some of the techniques from two of the cookies to help everything come together. And there we have the leopard scarf cookie. So now we are on to the last cookie in this set. And for this one, I'm actually doing a single consistency outline and flood. And honestly, why I did one consistency, it's purely because I'm alternating colors in these sections, and honestly, I just didn't want to deal with piping an outline and alternating the colors. So I decided to just wing it and go with one consistency. I will say that this single consistency was a little on the thin side. To be doing a one consistency outline and flood, I did have a bit of a spillover mishap on one cookie, but as long as I was cautious not to use too much flood, it ended up being just fine. Now, you could do that squiggle effect still with a single consistency outline and flood, but I didn't feel like trying to eye where the squiggles should go without the guide of an outline, so I decided to wing it and see what happened, and actually they didn't crater all that badly, so I'm fine about it. And I did let those light blue sections crust before moving on to this section here. And again, not a fan of the scribe when I don't have to, so I always try to just use my bag to pipe these alternating sections when doing flooding in sections. So I let that whole cookie almost completely dry, and now I'm going to pipe these lines on top. I am going to be painting every other line after I let these lines dry. It's super important to let any icing completely dry that you're going to paint on top of, because if your icing is too wet, it can cause actual like craters that are holes in the icing if it is still wet. So painting lines can be pretty tricky. It's quite the balance of getting just the right amount of liquid onto your brush, not so much that it actually spills over. It's really important when painting 3D details that you pipe the details with the same color as the flood. This gives you a lot more wiggle room and leeway if you don't paint it quite perfectly, because it just melds in with the background so you don't see any exposed line. Now you can see here that I just made a boo-boo, and honestly I'm surprised it took me this long because again, it can be really hard to paint such fine details without painting the flood surface as well. So I left it in here to show you how I try to fix these. It's not perfect at all. So first I take a brush with some Everclear or water on it just to try to get the bulk of it off the cookie. It doesn't work all that well with highlighter, but in my opinion, an attempt is better than nothing. And once I get as much off with the wet, then I go with a dry brush, here I am still trying to get it off with the wet brush. You can see it's changing the color. Then I go through with a dry brush and try to get off as much moisture as I can. So that's the whole set. Wow, it was a doozy, and I hope you have fun doing it yourself.